The night was negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Somewhere on the frozen steppe of what is now central Ukraine, a man sat beside a small fire inside a circular structure built entirely from the bones of animals larger than any truck you've ever seen. On the floor, wrapped in layered hides, a 3-year-old was asleep. The man wasn't thinking about survival in any grand sense. He was checking the walls for gaps. He was watching the smoke to see which way it drifted. He was doing what parents have always done, which is to make sure the place their child is sleeping in will still be standing by morning. That shelter had been occupied for somewhere between 0 and 429 years, according to a 2025 radiocarbon study led by archaeologist Wei Chu at Leiden University. His team dated tiny mammal bones pulled from the cultural layers around what's known as Mammoth Bone Structure 4 at the Mezhyrich site in Cherkasy Oblast, Ukraine. The results placed occupation at roughly 18,248 to 17,764 years ago. That is the coldest phase of the last ice age, the worst of it. And someone chose that moment to build a house out of bones and raise a family inside it. That choice deserves more than a documentary voiceover. It deserves the full story. Start with the problem they were solving, because it wasn't the one you think. The cold was obvious. What wasn't obvious was the window between dying from the cold and dying from the shelter itself. Build too open, the wind kills you by morning. Build too sealed, carbon dioxide builds up from your own breath and fire smoke, and you drift into unconsciousness before you realize anything is wrong. There was no instrument for measuring either, no thermometer, no gas detector. The feedback mechanism was whether people woke up the next day. Researchers studying Ice Age shelter sites have identified evidence of deliberate smoke management at multiple locations. At rock shelter sites like Abri Romani in Spain, hearths were positioned not just for warmth, but for specific angles of convection, pulling smoke upward and outward rather than pooling at breathing height. At pit house sites, the depth itself created natural drafting. The evidence across dozens of sites spanning thousands of miles suggests Ice Age builders understood airflow well enough to keep sleeping children from suffocating. They worked this out through generations of failed attempts that left no survivors to warn anyone, and successful attempts that were passed forward. And this is the part most documentaries skip entirely. Who was doing this work? In 2021, University of Victoria archaeologist April Nowell published research on the lives of Paleolithic children that won the European Association of Archaeology Book of the Year award in 2023. Her finding was specific and startling. In Ice Age communities, children comprised between 40 and 65% of the total population. The adults building these shelters, hauling mammoth bones across frozen ground, calculating depth ratios for earth-sheltered pits, were doing all of that, surrounded by children who were watching, carrying smaller loads, learning by doing from ages that would make modern child labor laws twitch. There was no school. There was no apprenticeship program with a certificate at the end. The knowledge transfer happened inside the shelter, around the fire, through repetition, proximity, and survival pressure. A child who watched their parents build a mammoth bone structure in the winter when they were 4 would build one themselves 40 years later. There is no written record of how that knowledge moved. What we have instead are the structures themselves, consistent across sites separated by thousands of miles, suggesting the information was stable enough to travel through generations without distortion. Now here is where the story gets specific in a way that changes everything. In 2015, archaeologist Alexander Duden began excavating what would turn out to be the oldest mammoth bone structure ever found at a site called Kostenki 11 on the west bank of the Don River, roughly 350 miles south of Moscow. The structure was eventually dated to approximately 25,000 years ago. It measured 36 feet in diameter and contained the bones of at least 60 mammoths, some of them still articulated, meaning they had cartilage and fat attached when they were incorporated into the walls. Researchers from the University of Exeter, analyzing the site, noted something that had been overlooked: natural freshwater springs in the area that would have remained liquid throughout the year. The builders of Kostenki 11 did not find that spot because it was convenient. They found it because it was strategically correct. Warm spring water draws animals. Animals draw hunters. and ground near flowing water stays marginally warmer than the frozen steppe surrounding it. The location wasn't chosen. It was solved for. Inside the bone circle at Kostenki 11, researchers found traces of scattered wood fires, burned bones, and food remains. There was also charcoal from trees whose growth rings indicated they had been living at the absolute edge of their climate tolerance, barely surviving themselves. Every piece of firewood was precious enough that some bones were burned as fuel instead, which means the builders were making real-time decisions about which material served the shelter and which served the fire. Every bone that went into the wall represented a calculation someone made about whether it was more useful as structure or as heat. These were engineering trade-offs made without pencil and paper, carried in memory, revised across seasons, and taught to children who would carry them further into conditions their parents had never seen. But the calculation that gets me is a different one. 40% to 65% of this community were children. The man checking the walls for gaps by firelight was not protecting an abstract idea. He was protecting specific small people who could not protect themselves. And the structure he was maintaining had been built with enough precision that a replica tested in the 1980s held an interior temperature of 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit when the outside was at -4. That differential was achieved with bone and fire alone. It was not an accident of design. It was the result of someone, many generations back, noticing that the skull placed at a particular angle shed wind differently, and telling someone else, who told someone else, until the knowledge became part of what you simply knew if you grew up in this community. And then researchers noticed something in the Italian record that makes the knowledge transfer question suddenly personal. At a cave called Grotta della Bazzura in the Liguria region of northern Italy, archaeologists found 180 footprints preserved in ancient sediment. A 2019 study, led by Marco Romano of the University of the Witwatersrand, used laser scanning and 3D modeling to reconstruct exactly who made them and when. The answer was, 14,000 years ago, a family entered the cave carrying bundles of burning pine sticks for light. 2 adults, 1 preteen, 1 child around 6 years old. 1 child around 3 years old. They moved in single file through passages where the ceiling dropped low enough to crawl. The youngest was at the back. Nobody carried the 3-year-old. She crawled on her own. This family was not touring. They were deep in an active cave environment that required physical navigation, route finding in near total darkness, and management of burning torches that were their only light source in a space that would swallow them completely without them. The 3-year-old did what Ice Age children apparently did, which was go where the adults went, do what the adults did, and learn. Psychologist Abraham Maslow spent decades studying what happens when shelter becomes unstable or uncertain, and the evidence from Ice Age sites suggests a version of his hierarchy that has no bottom floor where shelter is taken for granted. The families in these bone structures were not primitive people failing to achieve safety. They were people who had solved safety under conditions that would kill most modern adults within hours, and they had done it well enough to raise the next generation inside those solutions. This is the part that connects to you. You experience something called nesting behavior. Researchers in environmental psychology have documented it extensively. When people move to a new space, they rearrange objects, adjust lighting, identify exits and entry points, test locks. When sleeping in an unfamiliar place, most people report lighter sleep in the first night, regardless of physical comfort. Hotel rooms with identical beds and identical temperatures produce worse sleep than bedrooms people have occupied for months. When people lose housing, even temporarily, the psychological damage goes deeper than inconvenience. Researchers studying displaced populations consistently find that the absence of a controllable shelter creates a level of anxiety that does not resolve until the space does. The explanation is that some part of your brain is still running a check that was designed for conditions 20,000 years ago. It is not checking whether the mattress is good. It is checking whether the walls are solid, whether the smoke is going in the right direction, and whether the 3-year-old is still breathing. You do not think about your shelter. You have automated the check so completely that it runs beneath conscious awareness every night. In a house or apartment, that would have appeared to your Ice Age ancestors as something between a miracle and a god's trick. And yet the anxiety of sleeping somewhere unfamiliar, the specific discomfort of not knowing a space well enough to trust it, that is an inheritance. That is the man checking the wall for gaps, replicated in you without your permission. The chain from Kostenki 11 to your bedroom is unbroken. 25,000 years of people waking up, noticing a problem with their shelter, fixing it, and teaching someone smaller how to notice the same problem. The bones in Ukrainian museums are not curiosities from a dead branch of humanity. They are infrastructure. They are the accumulated output of people who were already doing everything you do, just without the part where the problem was already solved before they got there. A 2025 study led by Wei Chu at Leiden University placed the Mezhyrich bone structure at the coldest recorded phase of the last ice age. The people who built it did not have to. They could have moved south, toward warmer ground. Some groups did. The ones who stayed built something that lasted hundreds of years in the worst conditions the planet had produced in recent geological history, and they built it with a 3-year-old underfoot and a 40 to 65% child population, depending on the knowledge working correctly. The knowledge worked correctly. The next time you wake up at 2 a.m. for no reason and feel the urge to check whether you locked the front door, you are running ancient code. The next time you feel inexplicably uncomfortable in a space you can't quite settle into, you are feeling something that kept your specific ancestors alive through conditions that would erase you in a single night. 40 generations of people, minimum, solved this problem before passing you a world where you do not have to. The child who slept in that bone house in Ukraine woke up, grew up, taught someone else how to check the walls for gaps. And that knowledge, improbably, without writing, without record, without any mechanism we can fully reconstruct, reached you.